The meeting room door opened slowly, and the man entered unhurriedly. He wore a simple shirt, no name tag, no briefcase, lacking the kind of posture that the 22nd floor usually recognized as authority. He was about 46 years old, with graying hairs at the temples, a neutral expression that asked neither permission nor explanation. He sat in the only empty chair, in the corner of the table, far from the center, and placed his hands on the cold wood as if waiting for a bus. The others had already been there for 20 minutes. Ties, tailored blazers, laptops open with colorful graphs. Someone whispered something, then another. And then came the first laugh, not the discreet kind, not the kind someone tries to hide, the kind that crosses the entire room and doesn't apologize for it. The man who laughed first was called Richard Lozano, a sales director for 7 years, the kind of person who learns the power of the job before learning anything else. He leaned back in his chair, glanced to the side with a wry smile, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Did someone call the IT technician?" The room didn't erupt in laughter, but it breathed differently. That kind of breath that's complicity without courage. Two smiled genuinely. Others lowered their gaze to the computers, and the man in the corner of the table heard everything. He didn't look away, didn't open his mouth, didn't touch his face. He remained exactly as he was, hands on the wood, back slightly bent, his eyes scanning the room with a calmness that, if anyone could read, wouldn't be calm at all. Nobody in that room knew his name. Nobody had been properly informed, or informed in the way that mattered. The email had gone to the VPs. The VPs should have forwarded it, and the directors should have prepared their teams. But Richard Lozano hadn't opened the email. He rarely opened messages that didn't come from the former CEO, because the former CEO was the one who signed his bonus. The problem was that the former CEO had resigned on Friday night. And the man sitting in the corner of the table, with the simple shirt and cold hands on the wood, had been secretly appointed by the board 3 weeks ago and signed the final contract on Saturday morning. Richard Lozano had just laughed in the face of the man who now bossed him around, and the meeting hadn't even started yet. The man in the corner of the table was called Gregory Lair. He grew up in Texas, the son of a mechanic and a woman who sold lunchboxes door to door. He didn't have the kind of story that appears in magazine profiles, those trajectories with famous mentors and transformative trips abroad. He had the kind of story nobody told because it's too difficult to summarize in a pretty sentence. At 18, he worked as a warehouse assistant at a food distributor. At 22, he was already a supervisor. At 30, he had rebuilt the logistics of 3 different companies, always entering through the back door, always without the right attire, always being the last to be taken seriously and the first to be remembered when the numbers needed to change. He hadn't learned to look powerful. He had learned to be needed. Richard Lozano, on the other hand, had the kind of presence that boardrooms recognize before any results are even considered. Tall, well-dressed, his voice projecting with the confidence of someone who had never needed to prove anything twice to the same group. He had joined the company 6 years earlier, recommended by a partner who was no longer on the board, and since then, he had built a network of horizontal loyalties, the kind of structure that doesn't truly support anything but seems solid as long as no one pulls the wrong thread. His numbers were reasonable, never extraordinary, never disastrous, enough to keep going, enough to never be seriously questioned. He knew how to navigate environments where form mattered more than content, and that 22nd floor was exactly that environment, at least until that morning. The meeting was originally called to review second quarter targets. There was a prepared presentation, slides with standardized fonts and red arrows pointing to numbers that no one wanted to explain clearly. When the planning coordinator, a young man named Barry, arrived. As he began projecting the data onto the wall, Gregory Lair opened a small notebook, bound in dark leather, for the first time, and began to take notes. He didn't type anything. He didn't use his cell phone. He simply wrote slowly with a blue ballpoint pen, while the others around him typed with performative urgency. Joseph glanced sideways at this and tilted his head slightly toward Christina O'Neill, the sales manager to her right, with an expression that said it all without needing a single word. Christina didn't smile. She was already beginning to sense something in the air that Joseph hadn't yet felt. The presentation lasted 40 minutes. During that time, Gregory Lair didn't interrupt anyone. He didn't correct any data. He didn't signal any discomfort with any of the projections that were clearly inflated. He just wrote, page after page of his small notebook, with firm and organized handwriting, while the entire room pretended not to notice him. Barry, the coordinator, stumbled twice over explanations that didn't add up, looked to the VPs for support, and found nothing but neutral expressions. It was on the third stumble, when the customer retention numbers appeared on the screen, that Gregory Lair spoke for the first time. His voice was low, without emphasis, almost conversational. He simply said, "Does this data include cancellations from the fourth quarter of last year, or does it start in January?" The room stopped. Barry opened his mouth, and the silence that settled in was a different kind than before. If you don't already know this channel, subscribe now. Every week there's a new story that you won't be able to stop listening to halfway through. Richard Lozano looked at the man in the corner of the table with an expression that had shifted in tone. It was no longer mockery. It was the look of someone who recognizes they miscalculated but doesn't yet know how much. Christina O'Neill had lowered her face to the computer with unnatural speed. Barry, in front, was searching for the answer to the question with the agility of someone who suddenly realizes the audience has changed. And Gregory Lair waited, not impatiently, not cruelly. With the same silence of someone who has seen this moment happen many times before, in smaller rooms, in tougher companies, and knows exactly what it reveals about each person present. Barry's answer took 42 seconds. Gregory jotted something else down in his notebook and said nothing more. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. It was the same setting, the same chairs, the same slides on the wall, but something had irreversibly moved. Richard Lozano regained control of the conversation with the skill of someone who had done it hundreds of times, focusing on regional expansion goals, speaking with the speed and confidence of someone who knows the terrain well. He was good at it. He knew when he needed to fill the silence. He knew when another man's silence began to outweigh any argument. So, he spoke. He presented numbers confidently, used industry terms fluently, made a light-hearted joke about the competition that elicited 2 genuine laughs. It was a competent performance. The problem was that Gregory Lair was listening with the kind of attention that neither praises nor condemns. It simply registers. It was during Joseph's presentation that the first real mistake appeared. It wasn't glaring. It wasn't the kind of thing someone without specific experience would notice. Joseph stated that the net margin of the Northeast operation had grown 14% in the last cycle, using that number as an argument to expand the sales team in that region. Gregory Lair flipped back 2 pages of his notebook, read something he had written at the beginning of the meeting, and then wrote a single new line. He said nothing. Joseph continued. But the VP of Finance, a man named Corey Long, who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, slowly crossed his arms and looked out the window with an expression that seemed uncomfortable. Christina O'Neill closed a tab on her computer, and Barry, in the back, typed something quickly on his cell phone under the table. When Joseph finished, there was a brief applause, the kind that corporate lounges automatically produce. Gregory Lair didn't applaud. He put his pen down on his notebook, clasped his hands, and looked at Joseph with an expression that wasn't hostile, wasn't cold, wasn't anything easily categorized. It was simply direct, and he said, "The consolidated report I received from the board last week shows growth of 3% in that region, not 14. Do you want to review that number before we continue? Or would you prefer I bring the document? The room held its breath. Richard Lozano opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and for the first time in many years on that 22nd floor, he found nothing to say. The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds. On the scale of a corporate meeting room, 5 seconds is an eternity. Joseph recovered with the speed of a seasoned professional, saying he would need to verify the data source, that there was a possibility of methodological differences between the reports, and that his team would work on it urgently. It was a reasonable way out, technically acceptable. The kind of response that, under normal circumstances, would close the matter without further consequences. But the conditions were not normal, and Corey Long had crossed his arms and was now looking directly at Gregory Lair for the first time since the beginning of the meeting, with an expression that was almost one of recognition. Christina O'Neill had opened a new blank document on the computer, and Barry stood motionless, his pen suspended in midair. Like someone who had just understood something he would have preferred not to have understood. Gregory Lair nodded at Joseph's answer, as if accepting it without reservation. "You said okay," in the tone of someone saying it, because there's nothing more to say now. Then he turned his chair slightly towards Barry and asked about the methodology for calculating the churn rate of corporate clients. The question was technical, precise, and revealed a familiarity with those numbers that no one in that room expected. Barry answered as best he could. Gregory listened, took notes, asked another question. And so it went. Calm, sequential, without drama, going through each point of the presentation as if auditing a process he knows inside out. With each question, the space Richard Lozano occupied in that room shrank a little more, not out of aggression, but out of contrast. The kind of contrast that doesn't need to be said aloud for everyone to feel. The break was called at 11:20. People stood up, grabbed their cell phones, and headed down the hallway with the discreet urgency of someone needing to process something private before returning. Joseph went straight to the back window, his back to the room, cell phone in hand, typing with his thumbs at a speed that indicated tension. Christina approached him with a glass of water and spoke softly, very softly, tilting her head slightly. Joseph responded without turning his face. Corey Long, in turn, crossed the room toward the corner where Gregory Lair was still seated and introduced himself with the firm handshake of someone acknowledging authority, too late, but sincerely. Gregory reciprocated. They talked for 3 minutes. No one heard what was said. But when Corey returned to his seat, he seemed like a different man. It was Christina who discovered it first. She wasn't the type to act on intuition. She was analytical, careful, the type who checked before concluding. So during her break, she opened the company's internal portal, went to the institutional announcements section that rarely anyone visited, and found the announcement posted on Friday at 11:40 p.m. It was short. It stated the name. It stated the position. It stated the start date. She read it 3 times. Then she stared at the screen for a few seconds without blinking. When she looked up, Joseph was still with his back to the room, at the window, typing on his cell phone. Christina put her laptop in her bag, went to the hallway sink, splashed water on her face, and returned to the room before everyone else. She didn't say anything to Joseph. She didn't say anything to anyone. But when everyone sat down again, she had changed chairs. Joseph noticed Christina's change of position with the kind of keenness people develop when they rely on social reading to survive professionally. He looked at her. She looked away. He looked at Barry. Barry had his cell phone in his hand and an expression that looked like mild nausea. Joseph then looked at Corey Long, who had returned to his seat and now had his hands on the table and the posture of someone who had already decided which side he was going to take. Something cold ran through Richard Lozano's stomach. He opened his cell phone, went to the internal communications, and the first item on the list was Friday's memo. The photo was small, but it was unmistakable. It was the man in the corner of the table. It was the man he had called the IT technician. And the title below the name read, in institutional font, without any possible ambiguity, Chief Executive Officer. Richard Lozano placed his cell phone on the table with a calmness that wasn't calm. It was the kind of immobility the body produces when the brain hasn't yet finished processing the magnitude of the mistake. The meeting had resumed. Barry was projecting new data onto the wall. Voices were circulating again. But for Joseph, all of this had gained a layer of distance, as if he were outside a glass window, watching the scene unfold without being able to enter. He looked at Gregory Lair. Gregory had his notebook open, taking notes without looking at him. There was no satisfaction on Gregory's face. There was no irony, no sign that he was savoring it. And that was exactly what disturbed Joseph the most. He knew how to deal with enemies who showed it. He didn't know what to do with someone who simply continued working. The rupture occurred 20 minutes after the break, when the agenda reached the most delicate point of the meeting. The cut in investment in the after-sales team. A decision that Joseph had personally defended 3 months ago and which now appeared in the data as a direct cause of the drop in customer retention. Barry presented the slide without commenting on who made the decision. But the number was there, and the period was there, and Gregory Lair closed his notebook for the first time since the beginning of the meeting. He looked at the screen. He looked at the table. And then he asked, to no one specifically, and to everyone at the same time, who signed this recommendation? The silence that followed was unlike any other. It was the kind of silence that has a name. Joseph felt every pair of eyes in the room simultaneously avoid his face, and that collective flight of gazes was in itself the clearest answer that any words could have given. Richard Lozano took a deep breath, straightened his posture in his chair, and said it had been him. He said it firmly. He said it without hesitation. Because he was, above all, the kind of man who doesn't disappear when the ground shakes. And that was perhaps the only real quality he possessed. He explained the reasoning he had used at the time, the data that underpinned the decision, the context of pressure for efficiency that the board had imposed that quarter. It was a coherent defense. It was even honest. But when he finished, Gregory Lair was silent for a few seconds, looking at him with that same direct expression as before, and then simply said, "Thank you for the clarity." 3 words, no explicit judgment, no immediate condemnation. And yet, in that context, in that room, after everything that had happened that morning, the 3 words sounded like a sentence whose deadline for fulfillment had not yet been announced. The meeting ended at 12:40. People left in small groups, with that silent haste of those who need to process something before lunch. Joseph was one of the last to get up. He grabbed his laptop, his cell phone, the glass of water he hadn't touched since the break, and walked toward the door with his usual posture. Because posture was the last thing he knew how to maintain when everything else had crumbled. It was in the hallway that Gregory Lair caught up with him. There was no urgency in his pace. There was nothing to signal confrontation. He simply came to Joseph's side and said, in a low voice, without stopping walking, "You can come to my office tomorrow at 9. It wasn't a question. Joseph said yes. Gregory nodded and continued on his way. And Joseph stood in the hallway for a few seconds, alone, looking in the direction the new CEO had disappeared. Gregory Lair's office was on the same floor, but at an angle that received the morning light differently, more directly, more unapologetically. He arrived at 7:30, before any assistant, before any executive. He organized his notebook on the table, opened 3 reports on his computer, and spent 2 hours reading in silence. By the time his secretary arrived at 9:00, he had already scheduled meetings with the heads of each area for the next 4 days. There was also a handwritten list with 12 names. Some had a circle next to them, others had a line. Richard Lozano's name was on the list. It had no circle, it had no line. It had an asterisk, which in any other context could mean anything. But in that notebook that morning, it meant that the decision had not yet been made and depended on what happened at 9 a.m. the following day. Joseph arrived 2 minutes early. He knocked 3 firm times, entered when he heard the answer, and sat in the chair at the front of the desk without waiting to be invited, because sitting without an invitation was the kind of body language he'd used his whole life to establish equality. Gregory Lair observed this without comment. He had 2 cups of coffee on the table. He pushed one toward Joseph. Then he opened his notebook to a specific page and turned it toward him. It was the list of 12 names. Joseph looked at the paper. He found his own name with the asterisk. He looked up at Gregory, and the CEO said, "I don't make decisions about people based on one bad morning. I make them based on what the person does afterward." Joseph didn't respond immediately. He looked at his coffee. He looked out the window. And for the first time in a long time, he couldn't find a performance to offer. What Joseph said next wasn't calculated. It was the kind of talk that comes out when the ground has already disappeared and there's nothing left to protect. He said he'd made a mistake cutting the after-sales team. He said he knew this 6 weeks after signing the recommendation, when the first cancellation numbers came back, and that he'd chosen not to publicly revise the decision because revising it would be admitting failure in a company where admitting failure had a high political cost. He said this looking at the table, not at Gregory. And when he finished, he fell silent, both hands around his coffee cup, waiting for the kind of response a man expects when he's just exposed himself without knowing if the ground will hold him up. Gregory Lair jotted something down in his notebook. Then he closed it and said, "That's what I needed to know." Richard Lozano wasn't fired that week, nor the next. Gregory Lair did what he said he would do. He waited. He observed. He gave enough space for each person to reveal who they were when they stopped performing for an audience that had already changed. Joseph worked differently in the following days, with less volume, with more consistency, like someone who had removed heavy armor and discovered he could move better without it. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It wasn't a cinematic rescue. It was something more difficult and more real than that. It was a man deciding at 43 to stop being good at looking and start being good at doing. And Gregory Lair, who had learned the difference between the two while still carrying boxes in a warehouse in Texas, recognized this shift with the precision of someone who had done it before. 3 months later, the 22nd floor was recognizable only by its physical structure. The walls were the same, the windows were the same, but the pace had shifted. Meetings started on time and ended with concrete decisions, not promises of future alignment. Reports had been standardized with a single methodology, signed by Corey Long and approved by Gregory Lair on an unceremonious Tuesday afternoon. Barry had been promoted to senior coordinator, not by political appointment, but because his questions were the most honest in the room. And Gregory had learned over the years that honest questions are the rarest and most valuable resource a company can have. Christina O'Neill now led an expanded sales team, built upon the same after-sales team that had been cut, rebuilt, and this time funded with twice the original budget. Richard Lozano was still there. His chair was the same, his position the same, but the way he occupied the space had transformed in ways that those around him felt without being able to precisely name. He had stopped filling unnecessary silences. He had stopped using the volume of his voice as a substitute for the depth of his argument. In an October meeting, when a piece of data he had presented was challenged by a junior analyst with less than 2 years at the company, Joseph asked for the source report, checked it, and said aloud that the analyst was right. The room was quiet for a second. Not the silence of before, laden with hierarchy and discomfort. The simple silence of someone witnessing something unexpected and not quite sure how to classify, but recognizing deep down as correct. Gregory Lair left the top floor at 7 o'clock on an ordinary Thursday, descended the stairs instead of the elevator, as he always did when he needed to think without haste, and walked out onto the ground floor wearing the same simple shirt, with the same lack of hurry, the same free hands. Outside, the city had that specific noise of late afternoon, distant horns, footsteps on the asphalt, the smell of rain that hadn't yet arrived. He stopped on the sidewalk for a moment, looked at the building's facade without any particular expression, and then continued on. There was nothing spectacular about that gesture. There was no declared victory, no conquest staged for any audience. There was only a man who had entered a room where they laughed at him, done the work he knew how to do, and let the results speak, loudly and without haste, everything he never needed to say. Have you ever experienced extreme stress at work? Tell us about it in the comments. If this story resonated with you in any way, subscribe to the channel. There's much more to come.